Hello, everyone. We should be live on YouTube. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for registering and, of course, joining today's webinar. We will be commencing in about 7 minutes. So just making sure that as many people can join before we begin. We're also going to be live streaming on YouTube. So just as a reminder, if you're having issues watching the stream here, you can also check out the Cyber Rangers YouTube channel, which I will link. I'll just put a link to that live stream in the chat here. So just 1 second. Let me know as well if the audio is clear enough. I've just posted a link to the live stream there. We'll be starting shortly. So again, just to go over, hi everyone. Hi Jemima, Joshua, Mark, Ali Akbar. Great. All right. So it looks like the audio is fairly clear. So hi everyone again. Just want to thank everyone for joining in. So we'll give this a couple of minutes. Yeah, so as I said, you can post your questions in the chat and I'll try and respond to them as much as I can. Hello, Luis. Welcome. All right, I'm just looking at the chat here, so apologies if I look at my other screen. You should have also received an email to join our Discord server, where you can also post your questions, during and after the event if you want to communicate with me, as this will be a multi-day event. So, yeah, thank you everyone again for joining. I posted a link to the GitHub server, or rather, I sent an email. Let me just post a link to the the Discord server. There we are. So, 1 second. Just post a link there. So if you want to reach out to me after the event, or from today to Wednesday, you can do so. Yeah. Okay. I think we should be good to go in the next 4 minutes. Welcome, Lemon. Thanks for joining. Yeah, you can call me Akistplate if you wish, or Alexis, whatever is comfortable with you guys. Just going to ensure that the live stream is running, just so that we are good to go on that front. Hi, Vijit, Kulin, Chanoise. Apologies if I mispronounced that name. Okay, looks like we've got quite a few people here. Fantastic. Hi, everyone. Hi, Shahrukh. Thanks for joining. Doing okay? Hope everyone is doing okay. Okay, I think we have pretty much everything good to go. So I'll just mute myself for the last few minutes. You can post any questions you have before I begin officially. I'll try and answer them, but I'm just waiting for everyone to join in. I've posted the link to the Discord server in this chat, so you can just look ahead, or rather read some of the earlier messages. Should be displayed there. All right. Yep, you can call me Hackersploit. That's fine. Okay, so yeah, I'll just mute. In 2 minutes, we'll then get started. Okay, I think we can resume, or we can begin now officially. I'll just answer a couple of questions. So yeah, I'll be uploading videos soon, Angelo. Just been busy with a lot of stuff. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. I really appreciate it. This is the MITRE Attack Fundamentals webinar. This is going to be a 3-day webinar starting today, and it'll end on the 19th of October, which is on Wednesday. It'll be at the same time. So that's essentially 4 p.m. UTC, and each session will last for about 1 to 2 hours, depending on how much we need to cover. So to begin with, I just want to get a scope of the audience that has joined the webinar. So maybe as a beginner, sort of a beginning question, just let me know how many here have experience in cybersecurity or beginner understanding of cybersecurity. While you're doing that, I'm going to introduce you to the webinar itself. So as I said, this is a 3-day webinar where if you've registered and attended the webinar for all 3 days, at the end of the 3rd day, you'll get a certificate of, you'll actually get a certificate of attendance, essentially certifying you in that you actually joined and went through all the sessions. After each session, you should receive an email with the recorded version of the webinar. The webinar will also be available on the YouTube channel after the event. And we're also going to be leveraging quite a few labs, especially tomorrow and on Wednesday. And I'll be explaining that process and how to access the labs once we actually get there. So today we're essentially going to be working or taking a look at the fundamentals of the MITRE attack framework. Fantastic. All right, so it looks like we have quite a few people with some experience, some who are completely new. So yeah, that's great. That's great to hear. So I'm glad that I set this up to deal with that, or to actually deal with the target audience. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, thank you very much for joining in. You can also post your messages there on YouTube, or alternatively, you can also post them on the Discord server. So feel free to post messages wherever you're comfortable, and I'll try and answer them as much as possible. Okay, so Chris says he has a bit of experience. Yep, thank you very much for that feedback. Great. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen, and we can then get started here. So give me a moment, everyone. And you should be able to see my screen. Let me know once you can see my screen, and we should be good to begin then, officially. All right, excellent. So once again, I would like to thank you for joining in. I really appreciate it. This is our inaugural webinar on the CyberRangers platform. And as I said again, this is a fundamentals webinar. So we're going to be taking a look at the MITRE-ATT&CK framework. And more specifically, the underlying goal or objective for this webinar is to teach you how to operationalize the MITRE-ATT&CK framework for offensive and defensive operations. All right, so that's the objective. Now, some of you may be wondering to yourself, what exactly is CyberRangers? Well, CyberRangers is essentially a cyber range, as the name suggests, and it's pretty much one of the most advanced cyber ranges out there. The best way to describe it would be to essentially say that it delivers world-class cybersecurity training and capability development exercises using next-generation technology and services for the design, delivery, and management of simulation-based deep dive experiences in cybersecurity. What does that mean? It means that this is very different than any other lab platform that you might be familiar with. While other lab platforms typically focus on offensive and defensive topics like penetration testing and then a little bit of incident response, CyberRangers is sort of the synergy between the two, in that you have the ability to develop extremely complex environments that mirror the real world. So you essentially have extremely realistic training, or the ability to deliver extremely realistic training and, of course, consume it. And of course, one of the most important things is that CyberRangers fully supports the MITRE-ATT&CK framework across its entire CyberRange architecture and through its proprietary injector engine. And what the injector engine is the injector engine essentially allows us at CyberRangers to create environments where we can simulate adversary activity on the fly. So we can essentially create, various scenarios under which we can simulate adversarial activity. We can simulate Nmap scans, exploitation, reconnaissance, active directory enumeration, persistence, lateral movement, so on and so forth. So I've actually partnered with CyberRangers to bring you this particular webinar. This is an example of what you can develop with CyberRangers and what CyberRangers offers. So you can see there's quite a complex network infrastructure here that consists of different subnets and, of course, different configurations. There's a bit of Active Directory, so on and so forth. So you can pretty much replicate whatever environment you want. So moving on to who I am, or who am I, if you will. My name is Alexis Ahmed. As some of you know, I'm a penetration tester and red teamer by trade. I'm also the founder of Hackersploit. Some of you may know that already. And I'm a CyberRangers instructor and community lead. If you want to reach out to me personally, you can do so via my Twitter handle, which is @Hackersploit. With that being said, before I begin with the agenda, let me see if we have any questions. I'll be sending the slides after the session is completed. All right, so yeah, it looks like you should have the YouTube webinar link if you're comfortable watching it on YouTube. All right, excellent. So if we don't have any questions, I think I can continue with the agenda. So day one, which is today, we're going to get a formal introduction to the MITRE-ATT&CK framework. We're going to understand what matrices make up the MITRE-ATT&CK framework and how you can use them. to better, improve your skill set when it comes down to, or improve your intelligence, your threat intelligence when it comes down to offensive and defensive operations. We'll get an understanding of what tactics are in the context of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, how they're used by advanced persistent threat groups, or APTs as they're known. We'll also get an understanding of what APT groups are and how they impact the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We'll then take a look at the different types of software and malware that are used by APT groups primarily, and we'll understand what mitigations are in the context of the MITRE ATT&CK framework and how they can be used to prevent a technique or sub-technique from being successfully executed. On day 2, which is tomorrow, we'll get an understanding of what the MITRE ATT&CK Navigator is used for. We'll also learn how to use the MITRE ATT&CK Navigator for threat hunting and cyber threat intelligence. We'll learn how to map an individual threat group to the MITRE ATT&CK Navigator, and we'll learn how to take heat map analysis and combine it with cyber threat intelligence using the MITRE ATT&CK framework and the MITRE ATT&CK Navigator. On day 3, this is where we'll be doing some of the more advanced stuff. We'll learn how to use the MITRE ATT&CK framework to perform cyber threat intelligence using a practical case study for an organization. And we'll learn how to map multiple APT groups on MITRE Navigator or the MITRE ATT&CK Navigator. We'll learn how to analyze multiple threat groups and determine their priority techniques that are used by these groups. And then finally, we'll take a look at how to use Sigma rules within the MITRE ATT&CK framework and how to perform or how to automate adversary emulation with the MITRE ATT&CK framework. With that being said, before we move on to the actual MITRE ATT&CK framework, let's answer a few questions. So I have a question here from Mohammed. If you're watching on YouTube, can you get certified? Yes, as long as you've registered, and we'll be tracking the viewership here. As long as you've registered and you watch through, you will get the certificate of attendance. As I said, it's not mandatory. If you have something important to do, then by all means you can do that. You'll get the recorded version of the webinar. So yeah, any other questions before I get started? I'm just going to check the YouTube questions here, and also Discord. Okay. Okay, no more questions. Then I think we can proceed. Yeah. As I said, the slides will be available after today's session is done, so I'll share them. Yeah. We'll have practical sessions beginning tomorrow, so that's when we'll begin the real practical stuff. Okay, so let's get started. Let's get an introduction to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. All right, so what is the MITRE ATT&CK framework? Well, the MITRE ATT&CK framework is a globally accessible knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques based on real-world threats and threat actors, also classified as APT groups. And why was it developed? It was developed to improve the understanding of how cyber attacks are performed and to get a better understanding of the tactics, techniques, and procedures that attackers or adversaries utilize and how that fits in within the cyber kill chain. So to essentially contextualize what attackers are doing, get a better understanding of what they do, how they do it, what tools they utilize, and the impact of their tactics, techniques, and procedures. Okay, so what does ATT&CK mean? Well, ATT&CK is essentially an abbreviation for adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. So in addition to to the MITRE ATT&CK framework being used by threat for threat intelligence, or by red teamers for adversary emulation, or by blue teamers for defense, it also acts as a source of common knowledge between all of these sectors of cybersecurity, whether you're in the red team, blue team, and also purple team. So there's a common understanding when it comes down to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So the MITRE ATT&CK framework is typically employed or used as a baseline and model for adversarial behavior, and highlights the various phases of an adversary or a threat attack lifecycle, what software they employ, what operating systems they target, so on and so forth. And it is mostly used by penetration testers and red teamers to plan, implement, and orchestrate engagements based on specific threat actors or APTs. And this is also known as adversary emulation. Right. So what do I mean here? If any of you are experienced with red teaming and not pen testing in particular, when performing a red team operation, you're typically if you're doing a proper red team operation, you're typically going to be modeling the activity or the TTPs for a particular threat, or in some cases an APT group, right? And in order to do this, you need to have an understanding of what TTPs a particular threat group uses or an APT group uses. And in order for you to do that, you need to have a good understanding of the MITRE attack framework. And I'll explain why the MITRE attack framework. The MITRE attack framework is also a valuable resource for blue teamers, as it details the various TTPs used by specific threat actors and provides companies with valuable cyber threat intelligence that can consequently be used to implement defenses and mitigations. So this is its importance for defenders and for the blue team. So from the perspective of a defender, your defenses are only good enough if you understand your adversary or the people that are trying to attack the organization that you're defending. And the MITRE attack framework provides defenders with a lot of information, not just to do with how you can mitigate specific vulnerabilities and misconfigurations, how you can implement defenses, but also helps them better understand what attackers are likely to do, what attackers typically do, what tools they utilize, so you can build better defenses around that and get an better understanding of what the threat landscape is at a particular point in time, because the threat landscape is constantly shifting and the MITRE attack framework is constantly updated to reflect that. And I'll explain how this is implemented by the MITRE attack framework, or rather how this is categorized and sorted by the MITRE attack framework. So how does the MITRE attack framework organize everything? Well, as most of you know, it categorizes adversarial techniques into a collection of tactics further organized into techniques, sub-techniques, and procedures, also known as TTPs. So TTP stands for tactics, techniques, and procedures. And I'll explain what sub-techniques are as they fall under techniques. So this is an example of the MITRE attack framework matrix, the default enterprise matrix. And I'll go through this within my browser in a couple of seconds, but you can see it breaks down the actual kill chain, and MITRE attack has its own kill chain that it utilizes that differs slightly from the typical penetration testing methodology that you may be accustomed to. So I've not covered the entire width of it, but these are some of the different tactics that you have. So you have reconnaissance, resource development, initial access, execution, persistence, privilege escalation, defense evasion, credential access, so on and so forth. And each of these tactics are broken down into multiple techniques. And an example of a technique under reconnaissance is active scanning, fishing for information. And then each technique also has sub-techniques. So this may be a little bit confusing, but again, it'll make sense as we proceed. All right, so I'll reiterate the importance of the MITRE attack framework, because it's something that I feel and a lot of people in the industry feel is underutilized. Primarily because not a lot of people understand why they should use it, or they may be in a position where they don't really feel that they need to use it or don't find the information valuable. But again, it's something that's completely free, and I definitely recommend that if you are a penetration tester or someone who works as a defender, then this is something you need to be familiar with. And it becomes increasingly important as you move into the red team side of things. So why is it important? Well, firstly, it provides attackers and defenders with a common knowledge base of adversarial behavior based on behavioral analysis of attacks and threat campaigns. So what does this mean? It means that companies like Mandiant, CrowdStrike are already profiling threat groups, adversaries, and APT groups, and they then classify and organize them based on their activity. And of course, before the MITRE attack framework, it was very difficult to classify an adversary because there wasn't any nomenclature or organization behind how you do so. With the MITRE attack framework, it provides threat analysts with a standardized way of saying, okay, this is a threat actor or an adversary or an APT group. This is what they do. how can I put this down on paper so that defenders know what they're dealing with? And that's where the MITRE ATT&CK framework comes into play. So the second reason is it, of course, as I've touched upon it already, it organizes and categorizes and contextualizes adversarial behavior based on the different phases of the attack lifecycle. So one of the great things that the MITRE ATT&CK framework has done, or what the team at MITRE have done, is to expand the typical cyber kill chain to include phases that you may not typically be aware of, because as a penetration tester, you're pretty much going to be limited to either black box testing or white box testing. And that particular methodology, if you're using the penetration testing execution standard, does not include phases like resource development or exfiltration, because again, as a penetration tester, those do not fit. They do not fit within the scope of what you've been hired to do. Whereas when you're doing a red team operation, again, you're trying to emulate or to simulate what a threat actor, an adversary, or an APT group would do. And what they do ranges all the way from reconnaissance to exfiltration. So there's a lot of stuff that they do. And the MITRE ATT&CK framework provides you with a holistic view of everything that a particular threat group does, for example. And of course, as I've already mentioned, it utilizes a common and standardized nomenclature when referencing TTPs and APT groups, so that, again, when it comes down to not just tactics, techniques, and procedures, it also has a classification or organization for APT groups. And of course, APT group names, for example, are given by the companies that perform threat intelligence, and they have different naming standards, but all of that information is tracked within the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So, if we're talking about maybe APT38, which is known by CrowdStrike as APT38, but it's known by actually it's known by Mandiant as APT38 and CrowdStrike as Lazarus, you can see that may cause a bit of confusion. And the MITRE ATT&CK framework allows or actually displays that information. So you actually have or get all the names that an APT group has been assigned or has been classified with. So that is, some of the really important reasons why you should utilize the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So any questions here? Let me see. Okay. Today's session will range from 1 to 2 hours, depending on how much we cover. We have a couple of questions here. So, difference between emulate and simulate. Well, that's really a technical difference. When you're emulating an adversary, you're typically trying to emulate their activity, roughly speaking. And when you're moving on to simulation, you're typically utilizing an automated system, maybe something like MITRE Caldera, or you're using something like the Atomic Red Team test, where you're doing it verbatim based on what is there on the MITRE ATT&CK framework or what has been mapped already. And I'll show you how you can view this using the navigator. So yeah, thanks for that question. Hopefully that answered it. Let me check and see whether we have any questions. Okay, none there. So I'm just going to proceed on. So I touched briefly on what TTPs are, right? So TTPs, again, stand for tactics, techniques, and procedures. And generally speaking, tactics categorize each step of the adversary's attack methodology. So they represent the adversary's tactical objective. So what are they doing, right? What's the objective here? Are they performing reconnaissance? Are they performing initial access? Credential, are they trying to perform credential access? Are they performing lateral movement, so on and so forth? So it generally categorizes each phase or each step of the adversary's attack methodology, or the methodology that they're using. We then have techniques. Techniques are used to outline how each tactic is executed, right? So techniques represent how an adversary achieves an objective by performing an action. And a sub-technique outlines the implementation of a specific technique in detail. So what does this mean? So let's say under the reconnaissance, or let's say the initial access tactic, under the initial access tactic, we have techniques, right? And techniques outline how each tactic is executed. based on what type of objective or outcome the attacker or adversary wants. So for example, under initial access, you may have the initial access via spear phishing technique. And of course, under sub-techniques, you may have different spear phishing sub-techniques that different adversary groups utilize. You could have initial access via the exploitation of publicly exposed services or publicly exposed servers, so on and so forth. So you can see that you start off from a tactic, and then you can see that the adversary utilizes specific techniques within a tactic. And in this case, in the case of initial access, they may be using something like, as I said, spear phishing as the initial access technique. So that begs the question, what is a procedure, right? So we've taken a look at tactics, techniques. What are procedures? Well, procedures outline all known implementations of a technique or sub-technique. So let's say we're taking a look at credential access as a tactic. Under the technique, you could have credential dumping, and the procedure for credential dumping typically highlight the different ways or the different implementations of that technique. So it would cover dumping the contents from LSAS, the LSAS process cache, or downloading the SAM database file, so on and so forth. So you can see that this top-down approach makes it very easy to understand at a high level what an adversary is doing, as well as at a granular level, right down to the software that they're using to do it. So are they using Mimikatz? Are they using something else? So on and so forth. Now, for each technique, there's going to be associated metadata for each technique as well as sub-technique, right? And this data is very important. So whenever you click on a technique within the MITRE ATT&CK framework, you'll typically see this information displayed here. So the first thing that will be displayed is the tactic. So that'll tell you what tactic this technique falls under. And then secondly, and this is quite important, you have the technique platform. So this outlines the platform the technique can be executed on. So this is something that's very important because adversaries target different operating systems. And, based on the technique they're using, that technique, can only be executed on a specific operating system. So for example, if we're talking about credential access as a tactic, and we take a look at something like cracking the hashes from the shadow file, then that should already tell you that that technique is only relevant to Linux systems and not Windows. So the technique metadata will display this. It'll actually say this technique is applicable on these operating systems. It could be Windows, Mac, Windows, Mac, or Linux. And then you have permissions required and effective permissions. Permissions required is fairly simple to understand. This represents the permissions required for an adversary to execute the technique. So it's essentially telling you what privileges you'll need to do or to execute a specific technique. So let's say, again, with the example of credential access, if you want to dump credentials, then the technique will tell you that you need elevated or administrator privileges. You then have effective permissions. This will display the permissions that will be obtained by an adversary after successful execution of the technique. So if, let's say, you're taking a look at privilege escalation as a tactic and you're utilizing a specific technique, it'll tell you, okay, after executing this technique, you will be elevated or you'll receive the following privileges. It could be administrative privileges, it could be a service account, or anti-authority service, anti-authority system, so on and so forth. And then this is also very important, especially for defenders. That is the data source, right? So the data source outlines the data or logs to be collected in order to aid in the detection of the detection of this technique. So if you're looking at a technique from the perspective of a defender, and you're trying to see where how you can detect these types of activities on your network, then the data source reveals where that information can be extrapolated from and how you can implement that into your overall defensive program or strategy. Right, so I've already talked a lot about this, but I'll just go over it once again and sort of highlight what we'll be covering within this webinar series. So what are some of the use cases for the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right? And of course, I've covered, I've essentially said that it can be used by both by the offensive side and the defensive side, as well as purple teaming. But really, the most important or the most widespread use of the MITRE-ATT&CK framework has been with the red teamers, specifically for adversary emulation. So as I said, as a red teamer, let's say you've been contracted by a company, a financial services company, to perform a red team operation. Then you essentially begin your research or your threat intelligence process by understanding or getting a bit more information about the company, seeing what industry it falls into, and seeing what APT groups or threat groups target that company or targets the company or the companies that fit within that profile. And then you try and emulate that particular adversary or APT group to see how well that company defends against that particular attack. And then, of course, you have cyber threat intelligence, which ties into both the offensive side and the defensive side. Just getting a better understanding of adversarial behavior, activity, mapping adversary activity. And again, this does not need to tie into already existing APT groups or threat groups. You could be performing your own research and, based on, and this is mostly done on the defensive side, but you may have seen some activity, and you may want to map that activity. The MITRE-ATT&CK framework is a great way of mapping that. And then, of course, we have detection and response, and the MITRE-ATT&CK framework does this really well in that it gives you a lot of information about what threat actors, APT groups, or adversaries are doing with regards to their methodology, as well as the TTPs they use, and also the tools that they use, so that you can start building signatures to detect these tools. You can start building signatures and rules to detect specific activity, so on and so forth. And the final thing that I want to touch upon here is going to be the MITRE-ATT&CK kill chain versus the typical cyber kill chain. So if you're a penetration tester, you'll already be familiar with the kill chain on the right. And if you're new to the MITRE-ATT&CK framework, you can see that these are essentially all of the phases of the MITRE-ATT&CK kill chain that are available or are made available to you. And the differences are, of course, self-explanatory. You can see that when contextualizing a threat or when understanding a threat holistically, you need to consider a lot more than you would if you're performing a pen test. Because remember, even if you're working as a red teamer or a defender, if you followed this kill chain here, you'd not be getting a complete understanding of what's going on, because you'd miss phases like resource development. And this is something that has been identified, for a lot of years now, in that, if you want to better understand how attackers work, how APT groups work, you need to consider everything they do right from the beginning. So that starts off from reconnaissance, right? What do they do during the reconnaissance phase? What information do they look for? What campaigns do they run? When it comes down to resource development, what tools do they use? What domains are they buying? Where are they buying their domains from? What cloud hosting provider are they using for their C2 servers? What infrastructure are they using? So all of this stuff is very important and is something that is not highlighted within the typical cyber kill chain. And that's because you're only looking at it from an offensive perspective. The more you understand an adversary or adversaries in general, the better you're able to emulate them, firstly. The better you're able to improve your skills as a penetration tester, as you're learning from the best. And some of these APT groups are state-sponsored. And as well as from the perspective of a defender, you're getting a better understanding of the adversary. So, the MITRE-ATT&CK framework is very holistic and comprehensive in that way. And of course, you can see that it also highlights the key focuses of an APT group, which are typically going to revolve around exfiltration and or impact. What does that mean? In the context of APT groups, these types of groups typically stay within a network for extended periods of time. The reason for that is primarily because their main objective is primarily to steal data, intellectual property, disrupt systems, disrupt operations, so on and so forth. And disrupting systems and operations falls under impact, but these are the two micro classifications that you'll typically see under APT groups. A good example of this, and I'll cover this later, is, with Stuxnet, which was the campaign that targeted the Iranian nuclear centrifuges. That was more of an impact type of campaign where they wanted to degrade or wear down the actual centrifuges within the Iranian nuclear plants. And then, of course, exfiltration. This is typically the one that's most employed. Whenever you hear of companies being breached, they typically find out that the adversary has been within the network for an extended period of time. They've exfiltrated a lot of data, and most importantly, they've all done this without ringing any alarms or triggering any alarms. So they've stayed under the radar. They've done, or they've got what they needed, and even if they've been detected by that point or by the point of detection, it's already too late, so to say. Now, before we begin or we move on to the next step, let me try and answer some questions here. Linux or Mac, which is safer to use? So Linux or Mac are outliers in that Linux is typically deployed as a server operating system. And I'm saying this typically based on the market share. So most of the malware that you'll see will typically target, will typically build around that or with that in mind. In the case of Mac, the market share is too little for APT groups to spend a huge amount of resources developing malware for. So what does that mean? If you take a look at the market share of operating systems in the world, Windows has the highest market share. So it makes sense for threat groups, adversaries, or APT groups to develop their malware for Windows, because most organizations use Windows. They have Active Directory environments, so on and so forth. However, APT groups are privy to the fact that many executives, many individuals within an organization utilize Mac, whether they're using a MacBook or an iMac. And Mac is not, again, that side of Mac, when it comes down to malware and resource development, has generally speaking been left under the radar, because again, not many people use Macs. It's you may find one or two Macs within an organization, depending on the organization. Most organizations use Windows, and in the case of Linux, you'll typically see malware being developed to target web servers. So, ransomware, rootkits, so on and so forth. So generally speaking, yes, you are safer on Mac and Linux than you are on Windows, and that's because the majority of the malware has been developed for Windows. Yeah, we have a good question here. So Jasmine asks, in what context to use the term cyber kill chain? So I'm using this both from the perspective of an attacker and defender. So when I talk about the cyber kill chain, I'm essentially, from the offensive side, referring to the penetration testing methodology, where you start off from scanning or reconnaissance. That could include passive and active reconnaissance. Then you have enumeration. You then have exploitation or initial access. You then have privilege escalation, persistence, lateral movement, so on and so forth. The reason why I mentioned it, or I highlighted the differences, is because when people typically start off as penetration testers, and the difficulty they have when moving into red teaming is they still look at it from this perspective here. They still think that APT groups utilize the same methodology, and they think that they follow them in order, whereas the MITRE attack framework shows you that they don't. Some APT groups do not even go through some of these phases. They may go through recon, resource development, initial access, persistence, privilege escalation. They may perform lateral movement, and then they may move directly to exfiltration. So that's the perspective I was discussing or talking about. We have another question here. How long does it take to emulate adversaries? Well, it typically depends on the scope of what you're trying to emulate. So, are you trying to emulate an APT group? If you're doing that, there's a lot of planning that has to go behind that, because remember, if you're following it play by play or phase by phase, it also needs to correspond, roughly speaking, to the target infrastructure, right? And you may need to adapt the actual adversary emulation plan to reflect that. The second thing is whether you want to automate the process to a certain extent. And that's where tools like MITRE Caldera comes into play, Atomic Red comes into play. And the reason why these tools exist is because of the MITRE attack framework, because there would be no way to perform an adversary emulation operation or campaign without standardization. So again, I'll make you understand this in a little bit, because I know it might be a bit confusing right now. Yeah, so the cybersecurity kill chain, the reason again why I highlighted it is because that's sort of a very minimal way of looking at it. If you look at adversaries or attackers through that perspective, you're not getting the entire picture. You don't really understand how an attacker did something. You don't understand how they're communicating back and forth with a target system, for example, because within the cyber kill chain, there's no command and control, there's no execution, there's no exfiltration, so on and so forth. So when you take a look at the MITRE attack framework, you get a really good understanding. Now you can actually say, okay, this makes sense, because even if they don't go through each of the phases, you can sort of see what they are likely to use based on what their objectives are. So if they're an impact-based APT group, then you can pretty much tell that they're going to spend less time in the environment, but they'll try and target the systems that contain the most sensitive data, attack them with ransomware, attack as many systems as possible with ransomware, so on and so forth. If they're trying to steal intellectual property, then they'll typically do a lot of resource development, because they want to evade detection. They want to stay under the radar, because this is going to be a long-term operation. They're also going to focus a lot of time on defense evasion, lateral movement, command and control, because command and control is where a lot of adversaries make mistakes. You'll typically see adversaries or APT groups leaving command and control servers unprotected, without a proxy, all of that stuff. All right, let me check some of the questions on YouTube here. Yeah, I'll speak about the unified kill chain in a little bit. I still need to introduce the framework itself, and then we can move on to that. All right, so let me introduce APTs, because you need to understand APTs, even in the general sense of things, in order for you to understand how they work, how threats generally operate. All right, so what is an APT? An advanced persistent threat, also known as APT, is a targeted attack on an organization or company where an adversary gains access to the organization's network, establishes persistence, and remains undetected for an extended period of time. This is generally speaking. This is from the analysis, the heuristic analysis that has been garnered so far. Now, we're also seeing with the advent of ransomware that some APT groups are going for direct impact, which means that persistence and remaining undetected is not really a priority for them. They may just want to take down an organization, disrupt operations. And you have seen this many times with, I wouldn't consider it an APT campaign, but with ransomware attacks like NotPetya, so on and so forth, where these were primarily targeted at Ukraine and done by Russia, of course. And their primary objective was to disrupt the transportation infrastructure, where they targeted train stations, they targeted the subway, so on and so forth. So they again, some APT groups, it's important to understand them in that context. If they're nation state groups, or they're sponsored by a nation state, then their objectives might not really be tied to stealing of data, unless you're talking about Chinese APT groups. Chinese APT groups have been known, generally speaking, to target or to essentially gain access to technology companies, intelligence agencies, defense contractors, to try and steal intellectual property. And of course, we all know what they do. APT groups like from North Korea, like Lazarus or ATT-38, target financial institutions. Their aim is quite obvious. They want to steal. They want to steal money. Fairly simple to understand. All right. So based on all the data that we have right now, we know that the primary objective of APT groups is heavily centered on data exfiltration and not impact, although we are seeing a lot of that now, and that's because of the advent and popularity of ransomware. However, in certain cases, before they trigger ransomware, they may have already performed exfiltration of the data. So it's sort of a double-edged sword here. So given the nature of APT attacks, you can pretty much already tell, based on what they entail and the types of companies, organizations, and governments that they're targeted at, a lot of human and financial resources are required to successfully plan, implement, and execute an APT attack. What does this mean? Well, firstly, if you think about it, if you're performing a long-term APT campaign, right, and of course, I'm just telling you to look at it from the perspective of the attacker. Let's say a Chinese APT group. They need a huge amount of individuals, very skilled individuals. They need to plan it well. The plan needs to actually scale, into 3 to 5 years. They need to perform resource development. Why is this important? Well, if they're targeting or the initial access vector is via, let's say, a phishing email or an email with an attachment that has malware, they need to make sure that malware does not trigger any EDRs or antiviruses that may be on the target system. So it takes a lot of money and a lot of manpower to plan, implement, and execute an APT attack. And given the fact that these are long-term engagements, you need to ensure that the same team that initiated the campaign is the same team that handles it right to its end, right? Whether the end may be that the company detected the intrusion, or whether they just feel that they've got as much information as possible. Now, I've already covered on this, but I just wanted to touch on it again, and that is the objectives of APT groups. As I've said, it's primarily exfiltration, but APT groups usually have varying interests ranging from long-term reconnaissance and interception of communication channels to intellectual property theft, and that is quite common. Now, I've already covered this, but I wanted to explain and use a couple of examples here. And to do this, let's take a look at an additional categorization of APT groups, which comes in the form of groups that are sponsored by nation state, or state-sponsored groups, as they're called. Now, these groups are usually, as I said, their interests vary. However, depending on the geographic location of the APT group, you can pretty much tell what their objectives are, generally speaking. As I've said, if you're familiar, if you have a good, if you've been in this industry for a while, you know that Chinese APT groups target intellectual property. Russian groups typically target interference, or their main objective is disruption. And disruption can range all the way from business operations to even interference with elections. A couple of examples, or one example, is ATT-28, which is from Russia via the GRU, or at least that was the group responsible for it. And those individuals were later arrested. But ATT-28 reportedly compromised the Hillary Clinton campaign, the Democratic National Committee, and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee in 2016 in an attempt to interfere with the US presidential election. Now, another thing that I'll touch upon when we get to the MITRE attack framework itself, which we should be getting there shortly, is the actual names or code names given to APT groups based on their geographical location. So I've already covered this. Just highlighted there what might be the most important phases of an APT attack lifecycle based on the objectives. And I've added a couple of links and resources here. Now, throughout this webinar, especially tomorrow and on Wednesday, we're going to be taking a look at a couple of labs The labs are on the CyberRangers platform. You can register for an account by visiting app.cyberrangers.com. We'll be taking a look at a couple of scenarios or labs under the MITRE ATT&CK Fundamentals playlist, as well as some free ones that are available under the community section of the CyberRangers platform. Some additional links or resources that might be interesting here are, a spreadsheet that contains APT groups and their operations classified correctly with all their code names, which I'll be showcasing, and the MITRE Defend framework, which is a framework that MITRE developed specifically for defenders, because they also realize that defenders may be misunderstanding the use case of the attack framework, and as a result had to pivot and develop one specifically for defenders. And this particular framework is more so for defense, hardening, so on and so forth, essentially mitigation or preventative actions. All right, any more questions? Yeah, so we've got a question here. So the cyber kill chain, again, just to reiterate, the reason why I compared the two is to show you that when you move into red teaming and blue teaming, or the defensive side of things, the cyber kill chain might be the framework that you started out with as a penetration tester, but is not something that is viable or applicable. So yes, the cyber kill chain is more accustomed to penetration testing with a limited scope. However, with red team operations, the scope is pretty much as wide as you want it to be, based on the agreements that you have with the company that's contracted you, of course. But they can tell you, a company can tell you, hey, I want you to emulate APT38. I want you to do that. Let's say they're a financial institution. They can say, I want you to emulate APT38, and will not tell our SOC or our defenders when you're going to do it. So you just do it. We want to test and see whether our defenders can actually defend against this attack, right? And that's where red teaming comes into play, and also purple teaming. It's really helps companies get a very accurate idea of what they can deal with and what they can't deal with. And this allows them to defend against threat groups or threat actors or APT groups that target their industry specifically. Whereas a penetration test is very limited scope, because you're again following the penetration testing execution standard. You're not utilizing any sort of advanced infrastructure behind it. The objectives are different. Your objective is to find vulnerabilities and exploit them, whereas the objectives of threats are very different. They spend a lot of money and manpower on defense evasion, or essentially ensuring that you don't detect what they're doing. No alarms are triggered, no EDR or antivirus picks up the malware. And what does that say about the operations in comparison to a pen test? It means that whereas in a pen test, you may have found that a company has no vulnerabilities, and you could not break in, which sounds like a good thing. However, the red team operation will show you that you can get in. It's just that you have to look at things from a wider perspective. Yes, so the MITRE ATT&CK fundamentals scenarios will be available tomorrow. I'll show you how to access them for free. If you want to buy the entire fundamentals playlist, you can do that. Those come along with assessments as well. The MITRE ATT&CK adversary, or the MITRE ATT&CK Defender adversary emulation playlist, is free under the community section. We'll also be utilizing that to show you what an adversary emulation plan looks like, how to implement it, etc. So as I said, I'll post the slides in the chat after the webinar is concluded, and I'll post any additional links. So any other questions? I'm just going to check YouTube to see if we have any other questions. Sorry. I'll also be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered for the event. That email will contain the slides, as well as the links that I've highlighted here, and any other information that might be useful for tomorrow's session. Okay, so let's get started with the demo. So what I'm going to do now is just what we're going to take a look at is the MITRE ATT&CK framework itself, the matrices. We'll take a look at TTPs, illustrated APT groups, and of course, detection and mitigation with MITRE ATT&CK and the information that's accessible from the framework itself. So just give me a moment here, everyone. I'm just going to switch my screen. Let me just switch over to my browser. All right, I'll just take a couple of seconds. All right, I'm just going to resume sharing my screen here. Just let me know when you can see that. So yeah, this is the CyberRangers platform. You can see that we're going to be utilizing a few labs just to explain them right now so there's no confusion. Under the community section, these are the free labs that you'll have access to. We're going to be utilizing the MITRE ATT&CK Defender Adversary Emulation Labs. You can register for an account on app.cyberrangers.com. It's free, and you should be already subscribed to this playlist. So this essentially covers all phases of an adversary emulation campaign, right from planning all the way to automation and execution. The paid one, which is under the MITRE ATT&CK section, is the MITRE ATT&CK Fundamentals playlist. As I said, you will get free access to the scenarios we will be using, and those will be available under events. So an email will be shared with you tomorrow, or now you can access them. So hopefully that clarifies any questions there. Right, so this is the MITRE ATT&CK framework here itself. It can be accessed, or it's accessible under the URL attack.mitre.org. All right, and you can pretty much see the definition already. Now, if this is your first time seeing the framework, you may be a little bit confused. You may be. If you've seen it before, you may already know what this is about. So you can see these are all the phases of the kill chain here that MITRE ATT&CK has mapped out. And as I said, adversaries do not have to follow this in order. They can pretty much, start off from recon, initial access, persistence, privesk, credential access, lateral movement, exfiltration, or just move on to impact. So it's very important to understand that this is the attack matrix for enterprises. Now, when you're navigating here, you can see that it displays this matrix for you by default. This is the enterprise matrix. I'll explain the different matrices in a second. But yeah, so you have all of these tactics. So you have reconnaissance, resource development, initial access, execution, persistence, privesk, defense evasion, credential access, discovery, so on and so forth. And what falls under each tactic is the technique. So you can see under reconnaissance, there are 10 techniques, 7 techniques, 9 techniques, so on and so forth. And then for specific tactics, you can see you have this little expand button. If you click on that, that'll expand into sub-techniques, right? So for example, under the reconnaissance tactic, you have active scanning or active information gathering as a technique. And under that technique, you have sub-techniques like scanning IP blocks, which you guys should be familiar with if you're penetration testers. You have vulnerability scanning, wordless scanning. So, typical stuff that, you should be familiar with. And that is the same for all of these tactics here. Now, before we move on into TTPs themselves, let me show you how to navigate around here. So you can see you have the matrices. So one of the really cool things that MITRE has done is they also understand that the kill chain utilized by threat actors and APT groups is different for different organizations or environments. So the default one is the enterprise matrix, right? So you can see that it says here, below are the tactics and techniques representing the MITRE ATT&CK matrix for enterprise. the matrix contains information for the following platforms: Windows, Mac OS, Linux, pre-execution, Azure AD, Office 365, so on and so forth. All right. So the enterprise matrix contains all of these platforms here. Why are the platforms important? If you remember, as I covered in the slides, they're important because techniques and sub-techniques in certain cases are only applicable for specific operating systems. So this gives you a holistic view of techniques that can be executed on Mac, Windows, Linux, so on and so forth. Now, you can also sift through or filter through the enterprise matrix based on the platform. So let's say you're only looking for the MITRE enterprise matrix for Windows operating system. So you click on Windows, and now it's limited all the techniques and sub-techniques to Windows, or what you might find on if you're targeting an environment with Windows. And I'll get into why this last modified information is very important. So you also have the ability to show the sub-techniques, which sort of breaks down each individual tactic and highlights the sub-techniques that fall under particular techniques. So you can see phishing is an initial access technique, and the sub-techniques under phishing are, sending a spear phishing attachment, sending a link, spear phishing via services, so on and so forth. And I'm just going to collapse that there, so hide the sub-techniques. And you can do the same for macOS, which is really fantastic if you're trying to filter through based on platforms. You can do the same for Linux, and you can do the same for cloud. So you have Office 365. If you're targeting an environment that is using Office 365 Outlook, you can see now you have a much narrower list of techniques and sub-techniques based on that type of environment. So you can see that if I was targeting an Office 365 environment, and I was starting off from initial access, of course, that the only techniques that would be applicable would be, phishing, for example, and sending a spear phishing link, or valid accounts, right? Using default accounts. Let's say someone is, is using a default account, and you can also target cloud accounts, which I'll get to in a second. And then, of course, under persistence, you can see there's different techniques there. And so it all changes based on the platform. And broadly speaking, when we come to mobile and industrial control systems, the environment that you're working in. The same is done for Azure AD, which is increasingly becoming popular. And this is something that is constantly being updated, which is one of the really cool things about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, is it's constantly being updated. And that's why it's so successful, because you're getting up-to-date information with regards to TTPs, as well as information about groups and software that they use. And then, of course, if you're targeting AWS, then you can take a look at the infrastructure as a service matrix or software as a service matrix. And then, of course, one of the more recent ones that was added is the containers matrix. So if you're targeting an environment that utilizes a lot of containers, you can see it changes the matrix accordingly. And then, of course, you have the mobile matrix. So this makes sense. Mobile is a huge threat surface, or has a huge threat surface, because a lot of people use mobile devices. And more so now, more than ever, people are using their mobile devices more than their computers. So, while you may be combining your initial access techniques or utilizing mobile access to then pivot into a network, the approach for targeting mobile devices and mobile operating systems is quite different. And you can see that under initial access, we now have, apart from the supply chain compromise, we have quite a few, if we click on drive-by compromise, for example, you can see that, this is typically through a website or getting them to visit a URL, bypassing the lock screen, so on and so forth. And then when you get into credential access, the techniques change drastically than if you're dealing with Windows. So, access notifications, the clipboard data, credentials from the password store. This is more tied towards Android. So you can see that in certain cases, poorly developed applications may store the passwords in a local database. So, you can see how that affects the matrix based on the operating system or the environment that you're targeting. And then, of course, you can filter based on the specific mobile operating system, whether it be Android or iOS. And then, of course, industrial control systems, which is one of my favorite, which changes it completely, because you're now targeting something that doesn't really work like a typical AD environment. So the techniques are quite different. And you can see that, for example, under, let's see here. There we are under collection. You can see some very interesting ones like point and tag identification, program uploads, wireless sniffing. So, given the nature of the environment, the matrix changes. So hopefully that made sense. Any questions thus far? All right, so Jasmine asks, can you please shed light on when to use the MITRE ATT&CK framework or NIST CSF CIS controls? Well, NIST controls are mostly used by defenders and are essentially tie into security policies, so more so for compliance. The MITRE ATT&CK framework is, as I said, mostly used for threat intel and improving, whether you're an attacker or defender, your understanding of the methodology used by threats, as well as the TTPs, the tools that they use, so on and so forth. Okay. Right. All right. So pre is something that was just added recently. So under pre, this essentially means these are techniques, or rather tactics and techniques, that highlight the preparatory phase of a particular attack or campaign. So you can see that it sorts it into reconnaissance and resource development. So if you're only focusing on, or you're preparing for a campaign, then it's also added this here to shed light on the various reconnaissance techniques that can be performed, and then, of course, resource development. So, for example, under acquire infrastructure, you see, attackers or APT groups will typically buy domains. They'll have a DNS server, they'll have a proxy server, they may be utilizing a botnet. And of course, this is critical to the operation of any operation that's being run by a professional threat group or APT group. And under developed capabilities, you can see this is where now stuff gets really interesting. So under malware, that's a sub-technique of developing capabilities, and I'll explain how this works. But you can see that under the description, it says that adversaries may develop malware and malware components that can be used during targeting. Building malicious software can include the development of payloads, droppers, post-compromise tools, backdoors, packers, C2 protocols, etc. So a lot of some of the best APT groups spend a lot of time in resource development. They may utilize some third-party open source tools, C2 frameworks, malware, but what they'll do is they'll refactor it, obfuscate it. Well, not really obfuscate it, but sort of rewrite it, take what they want with regards to functionality, disable the pulling or loading of certain DLLs, etc., etc. Okay, so those are the matrices. Now, I want to cover the structure of tactics, techniques, and procedures, and cover the metadata of each technique and sub-technique. So I'll get into this right now. At the top, you can see that you can sift through tactics for enterprise mobile and ICS, and the same for techniques. We'll get to data sources, mitigation groups, and software shortly. But let's say, just for the sake of it, let's say we're interested in an initial access technique here, like, for example, phishing. All right, so I click on phishing. That is a technique. So you can see it has this breadcrumb here that tells you that this is a technique. It's under the enterprise matrix, and the technique is phishing. This was the metadata that I was referring to here. Okay, so you can see that it has an ID. Now, the ID is very important. Why is this important? For those of you who are defenders, and for those of you who are red teamers and have some experience with adversary emulation and also incident response, you'll know that most third-party tools or SIEMs or EDRs all utilize the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So, for example, if we're taking a look at, or if we were utilizing Wazoo, based on the data that's being collected from a system, actually contextualizes and categorizes activity based on the MITRE attack technique or sub-technique and highlights it using the ID, which is why learning the MITRE attack framework is so important, because you may see next to an alert T1566 as a simple example. And if you don't know it, you may be a little bit confused. But to Wazoo's credit, they've actually implemented the common knowledge base within Wazoo so that you can get an instant understanding of what that alert means with relation to the MITRE attack technique ID that has been displayed there. So you can see the sub-techniques that falls under this technique. So sub-techniques usually have additional numbering or versioning. So you can see that the technique, this technique ID is T1566. Sub-techniques will have that same ID, but they'll have variations or revisions based on the sub-technique. So you can see we have sub-technique T1566, 001, 002, 003, etc. It falls under the initial access tactic, and these are the platforms it works on. So you can see it's fairly flexible because it's phishing. So Google Workspace, Linux, Office 365, software as a service platforms, Windows, Mac OS, etc. And the contributors here, the version, when it was created and when it was last modified. Now, one thing that is important here, before I answer some of your questions, is that in certain cases, the technique IDs and sub-technique IDs will be changed or will be updated. It's not as frequent as it used to be a couple of years ago when the framework was constantly being improved and updated, because right now it's at quite a mature stage. But in the old days, the IDs would change. So in those days, I wouldn't have recommended, being able to identify, right off the bat. But nowadays, most of the techniques, the technique IDs don't change. It's more so when new sub-techniques are added or a new technique is created explicitly. So let me just go through the anatomy of this. But before I do that, I'm going to answer questions here. All right. So is there a chance that an APT may make attribution difficult by taking on the TTPs of another one? That's a very good question. That's a very good question. So yes, what they will typically do, they'll follow their own life cycle, whatever they choose to do. Again, something very important to understand is APT groups don't use the same life cycle for every campaign they run. It's very similar, but there's overlap between specific tactics and techniques and the software that they use. What they typically do to mask their activity is try and, for example, when developing malware, is they will try and change the region, the code signing to look like it was done in another region. So they'll try and, for example, if it's a Chinese APT group, and this was a recent example that I had seen, they'd actually utilize the Russian keyboard format as a standard on the system they were using to develop the malware, so that when analysts looked at it, it will look like it was developed on a Russian computer. It was set to Moscow time, so on and so forth. So there's multiple things that they do to even evade analysts from identifying them or identifying them accurately. So it is very difficult from a threat analyst perspective, but again, in most cases, there are a few giveaways here and there. So yeah, hopefully that answered the question. Cool. Any more questions? All right. Cool. Yeah, so just to clarify, pre is focused on activity before you move into initial access. So if you read this here, you can see that it essentially covers the preparatory techniques, so reconnaissance and resource development, right? And if you're talking specifically about developing capabilities and malware, you can see that this technique is platform agnostic, right? In that, it's not really tied to an operating system yet, because this comes after reconnaissance. So you develop malware after you've gotten a pretty good idea of what is required for the operation. Reconnaissance will tell you whether they're using a Windows Active Directory network, what version of Windows they're using, so on and so forth, right? And then you go ahead and develop resources based on your reconnaissance. So again, it's sort of like pen testing. If your reconnaissance is poor, then initial access is bad, or you'll have a hard time finding vulnerabilities and exploiting them. It's the same for APT groups and threat actors. If their reconnaissance is poor, then they'll not develop their resources correctly or in alignment with what the target organization is running, from both an operational perspective as well as a defensive perspective. So that takes a lot of time, which is why I pointed out and reiterated that these operations take quite a lot of time. Okay, yeah. So I'll try and answer that question right now. If you're performing a pen test or a red team, and let's say you want to do your own operation, well, these are all the phases that this framework contains, all the phases that you're likely to see when performing a pen test. So you have reconnaissance, initial access, which is exploitation, persistence, privask, defense evasion, credential access, all the way to, if you're performing a pen test, you'll probably be moving all the way to maybe command and control, but not impact or exfiltration, unless that is explicitly requested. So the question is, how to use it in aiding your pen test. So yeah, I'll get your questions shortly. So how do you use it to pen test? Well, if you're performing a pen test, I would still recommend utilizing the pen testing execution standard as a methodology, because it's more aligned with the legalities of a pen test, which is very important, because you can see that it sorts it into pre-engagement interactions, intelligence gathering, so on and so forth. But if you're using the MITRE attack framework, which is really good because it highlights individual techniques, you can pretty much say, okay, don't use it in order, but look at what needs to be done based on what you've been contracted to do. So if you're performing a black box pen test, then under the reconnaissance tactic, you look for techniques that align with you not knowing anything about the target organization's network or infrastructure. So, you typically start from, let's say, gathering the victim organization information. So you start there, determine the physical locations, identify roles either through social media. You can then move on to phishing, perform spear phishing, perform OSINT, so utilize open source, or rather databases and domains that contain publicly available information about individuals and companies. And that falls into technical databases as well, performing Whois lookups, etc. So it pretty much gives you a play-by-play on what to do based on what you've been contracted to do. If you're performing a white box pen test, then you directly move to active scanning, right? Fairly simple. You don't really need to explore resource development that much. And then, of course, you move on to initial access. So in a pen test, you'll typically be utilizing phishing, maybe in certain cases, not a supply chain compromise, valid accounts that may tie into your phishing attempts or your reconnaissance that was performed during the recon tactic. And then, of course, phishing via an attachment, spear phishing links, and then you can also exploit public-facing applications, which is very common. External remote services, WinRM, SSH, RDP, stuff like that. And then, of course, you can move on to execution, which is, again, just to do with essentially establishing your means of interacting, not really C2, but you can see that, specifying your command and scripting interpreter. So as a pen tester, you may have established access using an Empire stager. And of course, in that case, you'll be utilizing PowerShell. So if I take a look at the sub-techniques, you can see PowerShell there. Adversaries may abuse PowerShell commands and scripts for execution. So you may want to execute some PowerShell scripts for enumeration. If you're in an AD environment, you could be running a few, or you may be trying to import a few modules, run a few scripts. So, That's how it can be used for pen testing. Let me see some of the questions on YouTube. Just give me a moment. If you have any questions, post them now before I move on to the final phase here. Okay, so I'll start off by answering one of the questions here. So that's by Kingori. Kindly briefly mention what CAPIC is, how it relates to MITRE. Okay, so yeah, so I'll explain that here. So the CAPIC ID, CAPIC, let's see, let me go back to, let's say, initial access here. Sorry, let me take a look at something better than that, something that'll have useful information. I'll explain that shortly. So maybe under credential access, OS credential dumping. Let's see, sub techniques, LSAS memory. Okay, so it's not displaying it here, but when it displays the CAPIC ID, CAPIC stands for the Common Attack Pattern enumeration and classification. So it's a framework that essentially helps you identify and understand attacks better. So it's sort of like the MITRE attack framework, and it's also used quite a bit, but there are a few differences. I hopefully, at the end of this, if there is time, I will try and cover it, but let me answer some of the questions here. Can we consider resource development as weaponization in the cyber kill chain? Yes, of course. So that's one of, once you get exposed to the MITRE attack framework, there really is no way of going back to the standard cyber kill chain, because now you can see that you need, as a pen tester even, you need to give some time, or you need to dedicate some time to developing resources. And it could be as simple as just preparing infrastructure, before you perform a pen test. So the better prepared you are, the more seamless or the more efficient your operations as a pen tester are. So, right from using this, you can see the advantages of, performing resource development. All right, so another question here, please, could you show us the location of software programs? Yes, that was the next phase here. So before I do that, and it actually ties into this here, but let's say I'm looking at initial access, right? And let's say exploiting public-facing applications. Okay, so when you click on a technique or sub-technique, it'll then display the procedures, right? And remember, procedures are implementations of a technique. So this is where it'll tell you or give you a list of APT groups or threat groups and describe how they use that technique. So in this case, you can see the technique is exploit a public-facing application, typically a website, a database that has been exposed on the internet. Maybe it's the company website, so on and so forth. And you can see, for example, here, APT, it sorts them out based on their IDs. And these are the MITRE attack framework group IDs. And then it has the name. And I'll actually show you or give you an example of as to who named or who gave these groups or who attributed these groups in a second. So APT28, you can see that APT28 used a variety of public exploits, including the CVE 2020-0688 and the following CVE to gain execution on a vulnerable Microsoft Exchange server. So you can see that APT group APT28 utilized it, APT29, 39, but this is too vague because exploiting public-facing applications is a fairly common way of gaining access. But let's take a look at abusing elevation control mechanism, or UAC, on Windows. So bypassing user account control on Windows, which is a sub-technique. And this falls under defensive vision, which may be confusing because individuals, if you're performing a pen test on Windows, you'll typically do this if you're trying to elevate your privileges or if you've gained access to a user that is part of the local administrators group. So if we take a look at the procedure examples, you can see that it's not only APT groups, it's also other groups and software. So the differentiation when taking a look at the IDs here is that G represents the group, S represents software. So you can see that in this case, Apple Jesus has presented the user with a UAC prompt to elevate privileges while installing. So you might ask yourself, what is Apple Jesus or Apple Juice? Sorry, my bad. You can click on this here. You can see that Apple Juice is a family of downloaders that was initially discovered in 2018, embedded within Trojanized cryptocurrency applications. It was utilized by the Lazarus Group, which is from North Korea. That's APT&CK, I believe. So APT&CK targeting companies in the energy, finance, government, industry, technology, and telecommunications sectors, and several countries, including the United States, United Kingdom, South Korea, Australia, Brazil, New Zealand, and Russia. And because it's a downloader, if you know what a downloader or what a dropper is, it's been used to distribute the fall chill rat. So you can now see how you're getting a better understanding of how a technique can be implemented by a particular threat, APT group or threat group, whatever the case, right? And in this particular case, we've taken a look at how they're able to bypass UAC. So they utilized Apple Juice, and then Apple Juice was used to download the fall chill rat. So you might be asking yourself again, what platforms does Apple Juice work on? That's a fairly good question. You can see right over here, the platforms are Windows and macOS. Now, what's very important to understand is, and I'll get to this shortly, if I click on the fall chill rat here, you can see that it'll highlight the techniques used right over here by fall chill. So you can see in this case, it's been installed as a Windows service, which makes sense because it is a rat. And then the groups that use this software, and then there are references to this. Now, if you click on an APT group, and the easiest way to view this is under groups here, you can see that they're sorted. They're sorted here alphabetically, and they have different names, and I'll get into their naming and classification shortly. But you can see you have the ID, the name of the group, associated groups, because that's very important, because an APT group can be a superset of smaller associated groups working together, most likely from the same country. So you can see, let's take a look at admin 338. This is a China-based cyber threat group. It has previously used newsworthy events as lures to deliver malware, and has primarily targeted organizations involved in financial, economic, and trade policy, especially using publicly available rats such as Poison Ivy. If you've never heard of Poison Ivy as a defender, this would be a great place to get started with that, right? And one important thing that I want to highlight here is, let's take a look at quite a interesting APT group like APT&CK. Yeah, that's the one. So that's the GRU one. You can see they have quite a few associated groups, because APT groups are made up of smaller groups that could be running their own operations, but they come together to achieve specific objectives, right? And one of the things that I wanted to highlight is, if I click on APT&CK, it gives you the description here and the activity they've been involved in. It provides the name of associated groups here, the contributors, the version when it was last updated or modified, and then associated group descriptions. And then it highlights the techniques they use. Now, this may be a very difficult way of visualizing what TTPs were used by this APT group. This is where the navigator comes into play. So navigator, the MITRE navigator allows you to map techniques, TTPs, against the MITRE framework based on whatever threat intelligence you're performing. But it also has done this for you for all APT groups. So I'll be covering the navigator tomorrow, but for now you can see that it opens it up here. APT28, we'll give it a couple of seconds here, and you can see that it has essentially taken the entire MITRE attack framework and mapped what techniques and sub-techniques were used by APT28. And as we progress with this webinar tomorrow and on Wednesday, we'll take a look at how to utilize heat maps to generate a better understanding of what techniques and sub-techniques they use a lot and what sub-techniques and techniques they do not use or rarely use. And that gives you a better understanding of what you're likely to deal with. So you can see they started with reconnaissance and vulnerability scanning. And you can see that it performed vulnerability scans to find vulnerable servers. And then, of course, under reconnaissance, you can see under the description there that it harvested users' credentials, and the citation was from Microsoft. And then, of course, it looks like they performed some spear phishing here. They conducted credential phishing campaigns with embedded links to attacker-controlled domains. And then under resource development, you can see they performed drive-by compromises. Actually, that falls under, let me click, there we are. So under resource development, you can see that they acquired domains. And you can actually see the citations there. And under this particular one here, they compromised email accounts, so on and so forth. Now, the most important that I wanted to cover here, and that ties into software, is if we go to, let's see, credential access, right? So you can see they perform brute forcing, more specifically a password spray attack, and then some key logging here. And they utilized a few tools to perform the key logging. Now, you can always refer back here and sort of identify what key loggers they used. And you have the techniques here, but we can go directly to, let's see if we can find it here. I'll show you how this works. There we are, input capture, key logging. And you can then click on the references that are highlighted there. In this case, the citations are from Microsoft, the Justice Department in the United States, and Trend Micro. And if we click on key logging here as a sub-technique, you can actually see the procedure examples or the software that's used, that's been used to do this. So yeah, hopefully that answers the questions there with regards to the software programs. As I said, that's also available under software. So software is sorted via the ID, the name, associated software, and a description. So let's say you're trying to perform some research on poison ivy right over here, very popularly used. You can see that it has quite a few software descriptions because there have been variations of poison ivy, the techniques used, and then the groups that have used this particular, that have used poison ivy. So it's quite old, but still very effective, especially because a lot of the groups sort of repurpose the code or essentially refactor the code and sort of pick functionality from poison ivy. Very, very popular tool there, remote access tool. Cool. Now, the final thing that I wanted to highlight here was the spreadsheet that contains the APT groups and the operations. Okay, so this is a spreadsheet that is in the slides, and I'll share a link to the slides. But you can see that it's essentially a spreadsheet that is updated every 5 minutes. And the objective of this spreadsheet here is to provide companies, threat analysts, with a centralized knowledge base with regards to APT groups, their different names, their country of origin, and it essentially allows you to track all of these groups and their activity, right? So what this means is that if I click, I can sort through known APT groups based on geographic location. So I can say China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Israel, NATO, Middle East, others unknown. If they've not been categorized, they could be very small groups, so on and so forth. And then I'll get into the DLL side loading tomorrow. But one thing that I wanted to highlight in here is you can see that you have the common name. So this is the common name that this group is typically associated, is typically known as. So in this case, you can see that the group, let's take a look at a better example here. Let's see, yeah, we can take a look at APT40, but we can start at the top. So we can see we have the comment crew. Now, CrowdStrike refers to it as comment panda. Now, some of you, if you have taken a look at APT groups before, you know that CrowdStrike likes giving names to APT groups based on animals, or with an inclusion of animals in the name. And that is actually a very easy way of identifying or remembering where a group is from, geographically speaking. So, for example, in the case of China, CrowdStrike typically names their groups with the suffix panda. So, in this case, you can see Pata Panda, Gothic Panda, Numbered Panda, so on and so forth. The reason they do that is because pandas are native to China. So it's a very easy way of remembering where a group is from. The IRL has their own naming system. Mandiant utilizes, as I said, the APT system, or the APT naming convention, if you will. Symantec has its own. And of course, iSight and Cisco, Talos, and some of the other ones, Palo Alto Unit 42. But in most cases, CrowdStrike and Mandiant are the forerunners here with regards to attribution, and of course then getting to choose the names. But the most important thing is the common name here. However, it's important to take note of the names provided or used by CrowdStrike and Mandiant. Can anyone guess? Can anyone guess what the animal is used to identify APT groups from Russia? Let's see if anyone can guess that. Yes, correct. It's a bear. Yeah, so you can see it starts making sense if you use CrowdStrike's naming nomenclature. So you can see under Russia, you can see they have other names, which I'll get to why that is. But the Russian APT groups have been really well documented. And then, of course, what I did not cover, but I'll cover right now, is right over here. You have the common name. There's quite a few names that a particular APT group or group is known for. Another thing that is also very important to understand is, if I go back into Russia here, in certain cases, Mandiant, they actually do this, but Mandiant, when it comes down to naming, if the group is targeting financial institutions, you'll typically see the name Fin and then a number as a suffix. So, for example, let's see, yeah, there we are, Fin 7, Fin 8, Fin 6, so on and so forth. So just as an added piece of information, but you can see that if we take a look and see if we can find Fuzzy Bear and Cozy Bear. There we are, we have Cozy Bear here, APT 29. If we take a look at the operations, I know these were involved in breaking into some of the American systems, if I believe that correctly. Cozy Bear, yeah, that's the one there, Operation Ghost. And you can actually see the tool set or the malware that they use and the target. So more specifically, I know that this was their most infamous activity or campaign, where they had an active campaign to essentially influence and skew the 2016 US presidential election. So you then have reference notes. So you have this links to APT notes in most cases where you can learn more about it. And yeah, I just wanted to share this resource with you, as it it'll give you a much better understanding of APT groups, how they're classified, their operations, what malware they use, so on and so forth. And of course, what I did not touch upon, and this is very important, but I'll just go back in here, and let's say I am looking for, we can click on bypassing UAC again here. But under the procedure examples, the MITRE attack framework also showcases or highlights mitigations, right? And the ID again is M and then the ID itself for mitigations. So it essentially tells you different ways you can mitigate this particular vulnerability or misconfiguration, or at least prevent it from being actively exploited. So some of these recommendations are very useful. So check for common UAC bypass weaknesses on Windows systems to be aware of risk posture and address issues where appropriate. Remove users from the local administrator group on systems. Consider updating Windows to the latest version, so on and so forth. And then detection. So this is for the incident responders. So it'll tell you, it'll give you the ID, the detection ID, the data source, the data component, and what this can be used to detect. So a good way of proactively defending against this type of activity is to monitor executed commands and arguments that may bypass UAC mechanisms to elevate privileges on a system. Monitor newly executed processes such as event viewer. So it's already telling you what to look out for when it comes down to this sub-technique with regards to detecting it. And also look for Windows registry key modifications, so on and so forth. All right. Right. So I'll, because I know a lot of you are asking, I'm just going to share these links with you here in the chat. So you can actually access that and see that for yourself. I think that will conclude what I wanted to cover today. There's a couple of other stuff that I'll highlight tomorrow. One of them is MITRE Caldera and adversary emulation with MITRE ATT&CK. So from an investigation point of view, can these various softwares be detected by an industry-leading forensic toolkit? Well, forensic is post-compromise. So you're typically moving into the phase of malware analysis. And in most cases, most of the APT groups perform a lot of obfuscation and packing. So not sure if I understand your question. Cool. All right. So I'll take 10 to 15 minutes to answer any of your questions that you may have, as well as share the slides with you. So just give me a few minutes as I share the slides here. All right, so you guys can post your questions. I'm just finalizing the slides here. Give me a moment. You're very welcome, everyone. Yeah, so Nancy's question around guys who perform resource development. Yes, of course. So even APT groups utilize the attack framework because they have to stay as a few steps ahead with regards to essentially ensuring that that everything is or their software isn't detected. Thank you for joining, everyone. Just a few more seconds as I share this. Okay. Is the link to the actual presentation itself. Let me just see if it's working before I share that. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, everyone. Yes, when registering for an account on CyberRanges, you'll be sent a verification link via your email after registration. Just verify your account, and then you'll already have access to the MITRE ATT&CK MAD adversary emulation playlist on CyberRanges, and you can play through that. We're going to be going through them. As I said, once you're registered, make sure you're registered for an account tomorrow, so that we can actually go through the labs and some of the practical stuff. Otherwise, I don't see any more questions. I'm just going to check Discord and some of the YouTube questions here. Thank you, everyone, for the feedback. I've posted the slides to the individuals watching on YouTube. Apologies if you could not join. For some reason, we crossed our threshold there. So I'm happy to take any more questions for the remaining 5 minutes. That's excellent, Johnson. Thanks for joining. Okay. Yes. The recordings will be sent as soon as they've been produced, or rather edited, if you will. So you should receive it in your email. We'll also be uploading the recorded versions of the webinars on YouTube after the event is concluded. So you can always look back if you missed it. Okay. I think that's it with regards to questions. I can't see anything new here. So I'd like to thank you guys very much for joining us for the inaugural CyberRanges webinar. As I said, I'll be sending out emails to you so that you can actually join tomorrow's session without issues. We'll also be streaming it on YouTube. And of course, I'll be posting a link to the Discord as well as the slides beforehand tomorrow, so we don't have this issue again. But I thank you, everyone, for joining. It's greatly appreciated. Your feedback has been really, really helpful. And I think that's it from me. If you want to reach out to me, between now and tomorrow's session, or now and Wednesday, you can do so via the Discord server. Otherwise, I think that's going to be it, guys. I think we stayed within the time limits. All right. So, yeah, just going to end it in the next 1 minute. Give all of you time in case you have final question. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, let me share the Discord one more time. Yep, there we go. Also posted on YouTube. So we have a question from Tony. If you visit or you attend the final day, which is on Wednesday, you will get a certificate of attendance directly sent to your email. So as long as you're registered for the event, you should be good. No issue there. Thank you. Yes, so tomorrow's session will begin at the same time it began today, which is 6 p.m. GMT +3 or 4 p.m. UTC. So, yeah. All right, so that's where I'm going to end it, guys. Yeah, so you'll be able to see the recorded version of today's session on YouTube if you missed it. So you'll be able to catch it there. Yep, no problem. All right, so I'm going to end it here, guys. Thank you very much. I'm just going to end the session now. Thank you to Nancy, who was the moderator today, and I'll be seeing you guys tomorrow. Bye, everyone.